It won't appear everywhere.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. This is the Obligations of Memory podcast. We're speaking with Blima Lorba from South Brazil, and we've just completed her mother's really story of the pre-war and through the war. It's a fascinating story. They're both her parents from Chelm, Poland. And take it away, Blima, and let's hear a little bit about your father.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Okay, as you said, my name is Blima Lorber. I talk here as David Lorber Rolnick's daughter. He lived history. He was the witness of events that shook Poland in 1930s. My father, as a Jew and a Pole, felt the growing anti-Semitism in the country after the death of Marshal Piłsudski in 1935, as well as the atrocities that were committed by the Nazis when they invaded Poland and started the Second World War. Okay. His testimony is published in a book called, which title is As 14 Vidas de Davi, The 14 Lives of David, the boy who had the king's name. It's right here. Right. It was authored by my brother and me, and it has a mission to show how simple people were taken from their jobs, from their homes, mistreated, terrorized, killed for following different religions, different political views, and for not meeting the so-called pure Aryan standard, right? For not submitting to oppression and for fighting for freedom of thought and speech. David's story starts in a small town called Chelm in Poland, where he was born on March 1920. He was the second child of a family of 6 siblings, 4 men, Abraham, David, Jacob Israel, and Manes, and 2 girls, Hannah and Voira. My grandfather, Shia Rolnick, was a painter, house painter, and my grandmother's name was Heisla. She used to work with a store that would sell wood to burn. Okay? Her Heisla was near Lorber. It took my father 44 years to return in 1990 to his hometown with emotion and remember all his family, friends, and the painful events that left scars on his body and on his soul. I counted that my father defied death 14 times and he dared to survive. He was determined. Determination was one of his virtues, sometimes confused with stubbornness. But thanks to it, he survived the war and its aftermath. He kept throughout his existence a passion of life, even in the most difficult times. David's childhood and part of his youth were spent in Hell. When he was 3 years old, he studied in a cheder, which is a religious school where young children learn Yiddish and Hebrew alphabet. And at 7, he went to a higher school. In 1921, with the world crisis, he needed to help home and went to the forest to cut wood for his mother to sell. From the age of 11 and 14, he studied at the local yeshiva and joined Hashomer Dati, religious organization. There, he met the sweet girl Malka, but at 14, he was sent to Macheyev, which is a nearby town, to improve his religion education. But as he was kind of a rebel, he questioned some of the school learners and was expulsed, sent away. At 16, he joined this youth organization, Jugendbund Zukunft, of the Jewish Socialist Party Bund, right, who fought in defense of the Jews. When Hitler came to power, my father already knew the existence of the Nazi Party. On 23rd August, Germany and Russia signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, dividing the territory between them. A few days later, Poland was invaded and Second World War began, 1st September 1939. My father's family was at home at that time when everything started. Nobody ever expected the war to last 5 years. My father would say, I could never have imagined that there would be a slaughter like the Germans did. Nobody ever expected the Holocaust. Aware that they would be the first to be imprisoned by the Nazis, many men followed the Russians towards the border when the Russians left after they found out that the border was not right. So they crossed the Bug River. When Germany invaded and occupied Poland, nearly 19,000 Jews out of a 30,000 population lived in Helm. The city was bombed by the Germans on September 7, 1939. It was Rosh Hashanah celebration, the Jewish New Year. And a few days later, Yom Kippur, it was taken without resistance. Then the Germans withdrew. From Russia came the Red Army, which remained for only 2 weeks. When an error about the border was found, according to the pact, the Russian occupation left, and my father at that time was 19 years old, and he also ran away. He was robbed on the way. Bullets almost got him, but he managed to cross the river. From there, he went to a city called Lubomir, Ukraine, where he wandered until he found a bakery and offered himself to chop wood and earn a bread. He worked for almost 2 months there, and winter was approaching. In despair, he had only his body clothes. He tried to find shelter. He found shelter in a room with other 40 men. Without hygiene, the conditions were very difficult to live. But even though he didn't forget his family, he decided to return to Helm to take his family to Ukraine. When he arrived, he saw the treatments the Germans gave to the Jews. They took everything they could, the Germans. They cut the beards of the religious men. The great synagogue in Helm was burned, and the Jewish cemetery destroyed, tombstones ripped to pave streets, and even trees from the cemetery were cut down. The new synagogue, was used as grain storage. For the first time in his life, my father was slapped by his uncle Moses Lorber, who asked him why he had come back. His uncle had been tortured by Gestapo. Whenever the Germans occupied the city, they usually took 20 people well known, the rich one, as hostages. And this has happened to my father's uncle. He was tortured. But my father was not able to take his family to Ukraine. In Helm, as in other occupied cities, the Germans formed the Judenrat, a council of Jews, and ordered the recruitment of men between ages of 12 to 60, under the false promise of going to work. The men had to go to the main square. Some decided not to go. Others hid. Several thought it was better to flee. Many showed up, like my father, who didn't want to leave his family. At the square, the men were called by their name, searched, and their belongings taken. Anyone who would not hand them those belongings was beaten and cursed for being a Jew. Before the forced march started, the religious men were humiliated. They were forced to clean the market square with their bare hands and also to clean mud-stained boots from the soldiers. Several men were beaten, some were killed right there in front of the crowd. And then the Helm Death March began on September 1st, 1939, with about 2,000 men, of which only 200 survived. A publication in January 22, 1940 by GTA, Jewish Telegraph Agency, reports the Dead March from Helm, Poland. The publication of the news shows that the world knew what was happening, but it didn't care. Right? And there were millions of that before any actions were taken. The Dead Marches were also very common at the end of the war, Todesmarches, between 1944 and 1945, when the Nazis were in their overthrow. They took all the prisoners, foreign soldiers and civilians from different countries to German forced camps inside Germany. So when the fateful march began in Helm, the men were lined up in 4 rows. First they walked and then they ran. Whoever refused took a punch and a straight shot. This march then began towards Hrubieszów, which is another town 50 kilometers away from Helm, and then towards the border of Ukraine to the city of Sokal. The men couldn't speak, look at the back, look at the side. Violating orders meant execution. The men walked along muddy paths and reached the forest, where 20 men were selected to dig a grave. Shot, and while still alive, others had to bury them. My father always told me that this was the first mass grave from many others, and it is located 14 kilometers from Helm. Indeed, he was right, exactly right. This mass grave was found just in 2019, when 80 years of this horrible death march were remembered, with moving ceremonies in Helm by the second and the third generation, and a matzeva was put in there by the Lasting Memory Foundation from Poland. Going on to the march passed several villages, always under German guns. Those who could not run were removed and shots were heard. It was very difficult to walk and run on the mud. And behind them, there was a truck with a machine gun, and on the sides, motorcycles inciting the march and shooting whoever tried to run away. Around 600 men died on the first day on the way to Hobryashov. It was late night when they reached Hobryashov and they were put in a barn. They were hungry, thirsty, desperate, hurt, and they didn't know what was going to happen to them. The next morning, the Jews from Hobryashov were also taken, gathered in the main square, and the Nazis repeated the actions, and the march went on. At one point, there was a splitting of the march into two groups. One went to Sokol and the other one to Belts. My father was in the first group, Sokol, that reached the Bug River between the territory taken by Germans and the Russian ones on the morning of 4th December. Of the 2,000 men who left Helm, perhaps 200 survived. My father didn't even know how he survived. With great effort, he managed to cross the river and was arrested by the Ukrainians and handed over a Russian patrol. He was taken to the dreaded NKVD, the Russian secret police, which was responsible for eliminating political dissents during Stalin's time, right? The next morning, he saw over 100 people in the same condition. After having his name called, a man approached him and asked him if he was related to Herschel Lorber. My father replied that this was his uncle. Upon learning who my father was, this man managed to take him free to Lubomon, where he had already been, and again my father started working in bakeries to earn his bread. In 1940, he decided to go to Kovel. He tried to travel by train, but he was taken away because he didn't have any ticket or money to buy it. Luckily, he was disembarked in Mashayov, where he had studied in the yeshiva. There, he learned that his older brother was alive in a town, Lutsk, with some relatives, so he decided to go after his brother. While he was in Lutsk, his uncle Moshko Lorber also arrived from Vlodava, Poland, another town which was occupied by Germans. His uncle managed to escape Helm and escape the Death March. In Lutsk, my father did work a little bit in everything to survive. But soon began the registration for those who wanted to return to Poland and those who wanted a Russian internal passport, which would allow them to live close to the border, only with the passport. My father and his uncle didn't want. Suddenly, the police and NKVD took everyone, the ones that registered, the ones that were not registered. My father's uncle was taken when my father was not at home. When he found out, he went straight to the police officer and he said he wanted to be together with uncle. Both were jailed with other Polish Jews and put in a train to be taken to forced labor camps in Land Russia. The train was for cattle transport. There were no windows. Instead of benches, they had straw that was used as seat and beds, and had no bathroom for about 60 people in each wagon. As the train stopped, more people got in, until they arrived in Urals. The trip took 4 weeks, and they almost had no water to drink and received 200 grams of bread and often had to wait 2 or 3 or 4 days to receive the scarce food. They could not go out on the stations either. Hungry and filthy, many wanted to commit suicide, and typhus took many lives, and hunger too. My father and his uncle survived it, and when they reached Rose, they were taken by boat to a place called Perm, an open-air prison, because there was no way to escape from there. Both were registered for work. Perm was a gulag. Every morning, very early, they would go out to cut trees. They needed to walk 10 kilometers to get to workplace and 10 kilometers to come back and work 12 hours daily. My father had no shoes to walk every day, so he cut tree barks and braid them as a kind of a shoe and wrap them with threads around his feet and tied everything with a string also made of tree barks. When it got colder, they received a garment which was not enough to keep very cold below 0 weather. In centigrade, I would say it's 55 degrees below 0, which was terribly cold. People died from cold and hunger because prisoners didn't have enough to eat to stand such a low temperatures. Those who did not show up for work were arrested and tried without the right to defend themselves. They needed to meet the cut tree norm to receive 400 grams of bread and a tin soup for a whole day. But the bread was raw, as I already told, right? Made with more water and less wheat, so it would be heavier. Those who did not work did not eat. And that's how my father lived for 14 months. That is till Germany's invasion of Russia in June 1941. The prisoners got to know about the invasion a month later. Again, my uncle's father was taken to a known place, but this time my father could not do anything, not follow him. During Stalin's dictatorship, Jews arriving in Russia during the war were closely watched by the government. Once my father was taken away down by NKVD because he had too much political knowledge. He was questioned because they wanted to know what he had said against the country. He was denounced for understanding politics. He had to sign a document that he would face 5 years in jail without trial if he mentioned this, what happened to him at NKVD's office, right? My father was taken to a gulag, accused of the following crimes: being a Jew, a Pole, and a refugee. I don't think if they would know that he was a member of the Bund, he would be definitely lost. But at the time, the communists didn't accept Bund anymore, right? Russia had asked England for a pact against Germany. Before signing the pact, the Polish government in exile, based in London and under General Sikorski, demanded that Polish captive citizens to be released. When the agreement was signed, however, it took 8 months for the release. In this period, my father was taken further inland and was given only 200 grams of bread daily. As he couldn't stand so much hunger, he ate nettle to survive. He would cook it to get rid of the burning, being careful not to touch it with his bare hands. When he found potato peels, it was a lucky day. In order to find a potato or two in the soil, he had to dig a lot, besides being so dangerous because the guards would punish him. Before being released, he was taken again by NKVD with this excuse that he already knew about the war and that he would fight against the Red Army, helping the Germans. My father assured them that the Germans were the greatest enemies. Finally, he was freed, but the Russians trying to convince him to stay. But he decided to go to a Russian province, Kuibyshev, where he stayed until early 1946. He was free, but the work was still heavy and he couldn't speak. His task was to put logs in wagons, and he worked 15 hours a day. Now, in what was called freedom. When complying with the norm, he would receive 4 grams bread a day, 4 grams meat or fish, and 200 grams sugars per month, plus a payment, which 25% had to be handed to the government. My dad was still without shoes, with rocks covering his feet. In a bit cold water, he refused to work. He and another 17 men refused to work in this bitter colder weather. They would spend the day digging trenches, and the next day they were taken there and close those trenches, and or taking stones one side to the other and putting them back in the initial place. There, they started at 3 a.m., 3 in the morning, and the prisoners had to walk miles and work hard for 12 hours. With such a bitter cold weather, negative temperature, the body froze, and that's what happened to my father, who suffered for years for this reason. If they survived the hunger, disease, harsh condition, and heavy work, they still had to succumb to guards' violence, as they were watched by informants who denounced any word or intention considered suspicious. Anyone who was late for work 3 times was sent to a gulag for 3 years. The hungry person who dared to dig in soil for some rotten potatoes would have 10 years prison. For failing to meet the daily norm, they received less food and slowly died of starvation. So all the 18 men were taken to a trial without defense. Their crime was not showing up for work. One judge asked my father what was the reason for him not to go to work. He answered that he was a Polish citizen and who did not have the physical condition to work in such a low temperature. He was then, like the other men, found guilty and taken to a dark, filthy, bedless cell that during his jail time, he contracted scurvy. That means lack of vitamin C. And that could even have been worse. He could have died of it. Inmates had to line to be called by number. No one could take a step forward or a step backwards or to the side because it was considered flight, and he would be shot or killed. When the Russians were taken from the camp, the refugees were forced to work 20 hours daily. They learned in Siberia that German had lost the Battle of Stalingrad when a loudspeaker relayed the news and also Stalin's speeches. Again, my father was denounced by a man from his town this time for belonging to the Bund, the Socialist Party enemy of the communists. His life was in danger, so he decided to join Komsomol, the communist youth, and began to read Stalin's speeches for the youngsters. That's how he saved his life. On May 8th, the war in Europe ended. David still couldn't leave Russia. He had to wait in order to be allowed only to Polish citizens to leave. Anyone with a Russian passport could not return to Poland. From Poles, however, the government demanded several documents that didn't exist. In his favor, my father had the fact that he belonged to Komsomol and also a statement that he was part of the youth wing of the Communist Party. He received an exit permit. However, the Russians tried to deter him, proposing to work for the political party, which he rejected. But he was given a document, and the case, he changed his mind. My father managed to arrive at the Polish border in January or February 1946, when he was called by a Russian police officer to find out if he would stay in Russia. And he handed back the document and crossed the border. Even not knowing where to go, he entered the Polish border in a town called GMACH, a place unknown to him. He was alone, without family, and unaware of the dangers that surrounded him. The first days were of struggle and search for daily bread. He decided not to stay there and went to Krakow. He risked a lot because, as the return of Jews to Poland after the war unleashed several acts of violence against them. At the train station in Krakow, he saw people from Jewish movements receiving survivors who were mostly young men coming from the deeps of Russia, who were returning to look for news about their families and possible survivors. Although a supporter of the Bund, my father decided to stay in a kibbutz in Krakow, but he really wanted to go back to Helm to find out if somebody of his family had survived. One day, he ran into an acquaintance and asked him if he wanted to join him and travel to Helm. They did. They arrived in Helm at dawn and started to search the fragments of lives of their families. They passed in front of the house where my father was born. He thought, who would be living there? When the Jews were taken to the ghetto, their homes and property were confiscated by the Nazis and later taken by the communists. Both men reached the market square and discovered that there was a survivors committee there, and it was there that my father learned about his family fate. His mother's siblings, several uncles and cousins, and so many other families were missing. Some were taken to death camps and murdered. Others just disappeared in forests without leaving any trace. He was alone, but he had a hope that somebody had survived and was trying also to get back to Helm. He joined the committee and he was put in charge of finding rooms for those who came to get news from their families. He also answered letters from different countries with requests with the news from relatives. He stayed there for months. He met friends, but no relatives. One day, a military man, yep,
Why don't you finish that point, and then we're going to wrap up our second episode.
okay.
Okay, we're going to come back. Blima is giving us a terrific history lesson about an area of Poland, Helm, and her parents who have gone through so much during pre-war and the war days, not in the camps necessarily, but just a difficult story as it would be at the camp. So we'll be back for our third episode shortly, and please come back. This is Jeffery Giesener for the Obligations of Memory podcast network for the Jewish Culture and Holocaust Remembrance Group, and we're speaking with Blima Lorber from South Brazil. Thank you. See you soon.